President Trump has another prominent challenger for the 2020 election, Michael Bloomberg, a fellow billionaire New Yorker. But how might all this affect his Bloomberg news agency and his coverage of China-U.S. relations? Meanwhile, in Pakistan, U.S. criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative prompts Chinese and Pakistani officials to defend the benefits of their partnership. So why did the U.S. speak out on their joint development efforts? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. So another billionaire has announced that he will challenge President Donald Trump in the 2020 elections. Yet this candidate, former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, can claim even greater success as a businessman. On the other hand, Bloomberg would also be the greatest media tycoon to assume the presidency as founder of the global Bloomberg News empire. Well, that already presents a great dilemma for his news operation on how to cover their boss candidacy. But from Beijing's perspective, how might this presidential run affect Bloomberg's coverage of the China-U.S. trade war and broader bilateral relations? And while his fellow Democratic candidates echo Trump's tough stance on China, would Bloomberg himself continue with what's widely seen as a softer approach to China? Well, joining our discussion is in Beijing, Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, and from Philadelphia, Blackburn-Dwyer, President of the Grasshopper Strategies consultancy. Thank you so much for joining us. So let me start with Brandon there in the States. Bloomberg, a three-time mayor of New York City, is seen as a self-made billionaire, now worth estimated $53 billion. Much of that was earned through his innovative financial terminals, which later fueled his Bloomberg News financial coverage, of course. On Sunday, he announced his candidacy by tweeting, I'm running for president to defeat Donald Trump and rebuild America. I believe my unique set of experiences in business, government, and philanthropy will enable me to win and lead. Brandon, why do you think he's running for president, especially as a Democrat?
Well, Michael Bloomberg has always been a Democrat, except for his first race for mayor. He did run as a Republican when he ran for mayor, and that was largely about local politics and the fact that the Democratic Party's primary system was closed to him. You had to be part of the party's operations and machinery going back decades, and Michael Bloomberg wasn't because he was a businessman, and he knew he could basically slide into the Republican nomination because no one else serious was going to take it, and he took that nomination all the way to the mayor's office and then immediately declared himself an independent and basically ran the city for 3 terms as an independent with Democratic leanings. Outside of that example, he's always been a rank-and-file Democrat. He's always been very progressive, and he matches the Democratic Party. He's running now, it seems, in part because he's frustrated with the political field. I think he also sees that there's a possibility for an opening for him. Tom Steyer, as a billionaire, has not gained the traction that he expected. Mayor Pete is running 4th strong, but he's still a local executive. The other 3 candidates are Vice President Joe Biden, which is the strongest, but is also the most mired in the current morass around the impeachment. And then you have 2 senators. And historically, senators have not done as well in presidential campaigns. And so somebody with the executive, business, and philanthropic experience that Bloomberg has makes an attractive package.
There might be an opening for him. Mr. Gao, how is his Rebuild America slogan a link to Trump's Make America Great Again?
No, I think it's actually very good news that Michael Bloomberg decided to run. Why? Every one of us knows that he is a real businessman, but it's not that whether he has more money than Trump that matters most. I think what matters most is the fact that Mr. Bloomberg is a man of decency, a man of honor, a man of straight talk, for example. He's not a man of shadowing deals, for example. He's not a man who without principle. And I hope if he is elected as president, at least he will bring decency back to the White House, and he would bring more dignity to the presidency of the United States. And I hope he will also adopt an attitude of pragmatism and realism in dealing with China, because eventually China and the United States should not be enemies against each other. They could very well get along with each other, creating mutual benefit for each other.
So you feel like he's a solid man, but if there is one thing the Democratic candidates seem to agree on with President Trump, it's the get-tough approach to China. Indeed, some observers predict that even if a Democrat reclaims the White House in 2020, Beijing shouldn't expect a, quote, softer approach to bilateral relations. So, Mr. Gao, once again, how do you explain the widespread support for this approach?
Well, first of all, whether it is a hard approach or soft approach is one thing. I would say what China and the United States need is a more realistic approach, an approach of pragmatism, an approach of mutual respect of each other. China needs to respect the United States, and vice versa. The United States will respect China for its own benefit. And for China and the United States to get onto each other's jugular, that will be the end of peace and stability in the world. No one will benefit from that. And I hope President Trump will eventually realize this point. And I hope Mr. Bloomberg will also realize this very important point.
Brennan, what do you think?
Well, I think that Michael Bloomberg, like frankly, anyone but Trump, would signal a return to at least a rational approach to the U.S.-China relationship. While there is widespread support, so-called, for getting, quote-unquote, tough on China, the problem with the Trump administration has been that that toughness is displayed in wildly inconsistent values, wildly inconsistent statements, and wildly inconsistent attempts at potential deal-making. Michael Bloomberg has displayed throughout his career, both as a businessman and a member of the mayor of New York, and as an international philanthropist who has built economic ties with China through forums and other dialogues, that he's a man that likes to discuss things, that he's a man who likes to engage things on, as I would agree with my colleague, a pragmatic level. I would expect that if Mayor Bloomberg became president, or any Democrat, that we'd at least see a return to some discussion, some more focus on the actual economic issues that are at hand, some more focus on the future rather than the past, rather than what has really been lost over the last 15 or 20 years in manufacturing, or the changes in IP laws that we wish we could have made 10 years ago, and more pragmatic approach on what does this actually mean for the rest of the 21st century. And while it's a lot to say that Bloomberg could fix any of that, my expectation is he would be more practical and more focused on actual areas that the cooperation could really deliver benefits for both countries.
And along those lines, there are actually signs as to why Bloomberg may indeed take a softer approach to China. Many observers said, in late September, he described Chinese President Xi Jinping as, quote, not a dictator, and praised President Xi's government for its responsiveness to public concerns about environmental pollution. And he also engaged with China by founding the New Economy Forum, which he reportedly envisions as one day being on par with Davos. Now, the forum just met for a second time last week in Beijing. So, as a Democratic candidate, Mr. Gao, what approach do you think Bloomberg would take toward China? What might be his stance toward China-U.S. trade war?
Now, first of all, I think Mike Bloomberg has a very solid track record, and that speaks for itself. Now, going forward, when he becomes candidate Bloomberg, or nominee Bloomberg, or eventually president-elect, or eventually president of the United States, I hope he will bring decency, a sense of responsibility, a sense of fairness, a sense of balance to China-U.S. relations, as, for example, for U.S. relations with any other country. I think the United States has suffered a great deal over the past 2 years or so for the loss of leadership, for the loss of respect in many parts of the world, because it is really running afoul of its own principles and is losing friends as we speak in many parts of the world. I hope Mr. Bloomberg will reverse this trend and will really bring more honor and respect for the United States among people throughout the world.
What kind of approach he will take? This is a million-dollar question. Brandon, what do you think? If elected president, what overall approach might he take toward China's rise?
Well, one, it's pretty hard to predict. The man just announced that he's running for president. With that caveat said, what I would say is, one, any Democrat going back into the White House would reintroduce or add a focus on politics, add a focus on areas that China has historically not wanted to include in trade talks around human rights, the like, security, those kind of issues. Things that really Trump recently has basically said are not going to be part of the trade talks. Now, with that sort of negative positive, Bloomberg would actually have ties to the business community. He would actually have understanding of how the U.S. economy integrates with China and how cooperation is actually beneficial. Through his own forums, through his own business context, through his company's extensive experiences doing business inside China and across Asia, you would have a U.S. leader that actually understands the global economy and understands that the future is better off with cooperation. The future is better off focusing on the jobs of tomorrow. Just like Mike Bloomberg's actual campaign slogan is, fight for the future, you would see a president, I believe, running a trade policy that was focused on jobs in 2050, not jobs in 1995, as I find President Trump often focuses on.
And that said, the South China Morning Post, Brandon, recently published an interesting opinion piece asserting why Bloomberg's candidacy might not be good for Beijing. The commentary piece suggested that this, quote, history of self-censorship regarding China might spur his fellow Democratic rivals to exploit that and publicly press him on his China views. That could in turn attract unwelcome attention and probably more unflattering coverage. What do you think, Brandon?
I think it's fair to be concerned about that from a Chinese perspective. Mayor Bloomberg and Bloomberg News has a bit of a patchy history on covering China. They, at one point, were a leading investigative body on news inside China, and then, by some reports, decided to spike other investigative stories, in part because the Bloomberg financial empire wanted the news media to stop doing that because it was hurting their business. And so that would be a common line of attack against Mayor Bloomberg, and obviously, in that sense, could potentially bring up some negative issues or negative concerns about China. But if we're really fighting about Bloomberg about that, I don't think China has too much to worry about it, because then we're going to be talking about Bloomberg and Bloomberg News and how much impact it has on the candidacy and what he did 5 or 6 years ago or 7 years ago. I don't think that that's really going to shape or change the current approach to China, other than to say that other Democratic candidates are just going to try to find space between themselves and Bloomberg and say that he's more pro-China. But the reality is many U.S. people, many U.S. consumers want a more positive approach to the trade war. They want an end to needless costing of consumers, and they want an end to the high tariffs that are costing people money as they shop for the Christmas season. And so that could actually end up helping Bloomberg and lead to setting up, if Bloomberg were to win, which is a huge, huge if, a better table, shall we say, for a deal post-2020 election if it were President Bloomberg running the show.
Yeah, and at the heart of this alleged self-censorship are past instances where Bloomberg News coverage reportedly angered Beijing and may have affected the company's ability to do business in China. But that raised a fascinating issue about the dilemma that Bloomberg News now faces. On Sunday, as CNN's media specialist Oliver Darcy highlighted, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief informed his staff about how they will try to cover their boss and his rival candidates as neutrally as possible. But, Mr. Gao, perception is often even more important than reality. How likely is it that, in the eyes of a skeptical audience, a Bloomberg candidacy may harm the reputation of Bloomberg News?
Now, I think Michael Bloomberg will bring onto the table much more than Bloomberg News, which is important in itself. But I think Bloomberg will bring with him a sense of responsibility, a sense of fairness, a sense of history, and what will be the right thing for the United States as a superpower to do. And in that respect, whatever the result of the presidential election next year, China as a country need to deal with the President of the United States as he or she deserves. And China has always dealt with the presidency of the United States very, very carefully with full responsibility. Why? Because China wants to be a friend of the United States. China does not want to create animosity or hostility with the United States. And I hope President Trump, if elected, or Michael Bloomberg, if elected, will reciprocate, will deal with China with a sense of responsibility, with a sense of fairness. That's what needed for China-U.S. relations going forward.
All right, let's leave it there. Many thanks to Victor Gao from the Center for China and Globalization and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer of Grasshopper Strategies.